All right, we're back. I'm back. I'm here by myself. It's been a while since I've recorded one of these little mini episodes. The big question we're going to be tackling in this mini episode is, does a beginner need a practice routine or a practice schedule?
You won't create a style because style is a crystallization, and that way it's a process of continuing growth.
It's a really rainy day here. It's coming into autumn. It's nice and cozy in the studio. I've been hanging out with Bonnie all morning, my daughter. Me and my wife had a nice lunch. Now I'm back down the studio here, and I wanted to share some of my thoughts and some of the stuff that comes up a lot with our students. And I thought that using these little mini episodes would be a great way for me to answer some of those questions for you. So let's get into it. The big question we're going to be tackling in this mini episode is, does a beginner need a practice routine or a practice schedule? Now, the reason I wanted to dive into this is because there's kind of, for me, I see it from maybe two, maybe three different ways, but certainly two main different ways. And I want to explain those. Now, the first one is kind of obvious. And that is that everybody should have a practice routine, whatever that looks like for you. It doesn't need to be 4 hours a day. It could be 4 minutes a day, whatever you can fit in. But just because you're a beginner, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't be organized and shouldn't plan your practice and shouldn't know exactly what's happening when you do sit down to do that practice, whether it's 4 minutes, 40 minutes, 4 hours, whatever it is. So there's lots that we can go into around the sort of discipline around that and the sort of how you build that practice routine. That's for another episode because that's a whole thing, and that's actually in the drumming world like quite a thing. The perfect practice routine. It's kind of a holy grail for us drummers trying to find the most perfect practice routine. Does it exist? Who knows? I think everyone's so individual that there can't be one and the same for everybody. There's too many variables in people's lives, I think, to have one size fits all for your practice routine. But what we can talk about is why it's important as a beginner. Or in fact, do you know what? It doesn't matter whether you're a beginner or not, I don't think. I think whether you've just started or if you've been playing for 30 years, having a practice routine and being organized and being structured around your practice is the quickest way to results and the most effective way to results. Not even necessarily quickest, but the most effective way to get good, solid, long-lasting results. So that's kind of covering the broader spectrum of why a beginner, or sorry, the sort of like the structured side of why a beginner would need some kind of practice schedule or practice routine, because obviously we don't want to waste time when we get into the practice room. This is a thing I'm big on with my students, and I try to be with myself as well. It's not so bad now that we have a permanent studio, so I sometimes can come in and kind of mess around a little bit and just have fun for fun's sake. But actually, when I was paying by the hour for my practice rooms, man, like I calculated once, I think I figured out that I would book 4 hour sessions when I used to go and hire practice rooms. Definitely before I had a child, before I had a baby. That doesn't happen very often anymore. And I figured out that I was wasting nearly 45 minutes of that time, nearly an hour on some days, messing around with deciding what to practice, setting the drums up, making sure everything's comfortable, getting all my materials out, my resources, all that type of stuff. And actually I realized if I had done all that before I got in the practice room, then I didn't waste any of that time, or I wasted a lot less time. And when you're paying for that by the hour, especially and there's like the other piece to that is, for me, not everybody, but I was sort of that sort of struggling artist when I was in my 20s doing the thing and trying to make ends meet and hustle, and money was important to be, or money was not scarce. It wasn't that bad, but anyway, any money I spent, I wanted to make sure I was getting as much value out of that as possible. So that's the kind of, that's the kind of things. I keep going to wrap this section of it up, but then realizing that actually there's a lot, there's more to it. There's always more. So keeping that sort of discipline side, that structured side for a beginner is super important, or is just as important as it would be for someone who's an intermediate or an advanced player. The second sort of big piece for me with having a practice routine around a beginner or for a beginner is I'm a huge believer in expression, exploration, if that's the right word, exploration and creativity. And sometimes or I find in my experience with my students, and I have found over the years, when I try to sort of, when I say discipline, I don't mean discipline the student. I mean like put structure or discipline into their practice and make sure it's consistent and make sure it's regular and make sure you're ticking these boxes, yada, yada, yada. I've actually found that sometimes that can have an opposite effect in the students like want to practice, in their drive and their motivation to sit down and practice. I think that this is because in the beginning stages of learning something, exploration and fun and building the rapport and the love with what you're doing is super important. And if the beginner or the student is being structured too much all of the time, I'm not saying never, but I'm saying most of the time in that first year or 2 years, I think the practice routine should be a little bit more flexible and based around fun and falling in love and working out how the drums work. Like I can't tell you the amount of times students come to me, whether it's in a school or here in the studio, and they ask me, what does this do on the drum kit? They know, why does the hi-hat clutch do this? Or why does the snare have this on it? Or whatever it might be. And I used to try and sort of quash that curiosity and say, let's focus on what we're doing and start bringing it back to the lesson. And what I started doing actually was the total opposite, was letting the student spend a minute or two or 5 or 10, maybe not more than that if it's a 30-minute lesson, but letting them find out what that little thing does, or why this piece of metal turns the way it does, or why does a cymbal swing that way, or I'm thinking of examples. It could be anything, and that's actually part of the point. That's actually part of the point, is that there is almost in the beginning stages what can feel like an infinite amount of questions, and this huge mountain to climb when we're like trying to learn an instrument, and actually just allowing a student, again, a beginner student, to have the time to explore and look and find out and learn those answers for themselves through a practical like application of what they're doing is, I've found, super important and really powerful with, or when it comes to their want to be around the drums. And for me now in this position as owning this drum school, there's two things now. There's a double side to that, double side to that for me. And I mean it when I say this. I say it a lot. My passion is sharing my knowledge and my love for drums with people. That is my mission, and that's what I'm doing. There's another side to it now for me where I'm running a business and I have a family to support. So not only does it tick the sort of heart box for me with the student wanting to be here, wanting to learn more, wanting to develop that curiosity and that love for the instrument. But as a business owner, it also keeps my student retention up because I want them to want to be around the drums. I want them to want and feel the sort of drive and the call to go into those places to explore and want to come back to the studio and want to come and hang out. I realized that if I keep squashing that curiosity, they're just going to get bored and they're going to get over it. And they're not going to find those sort of intrinsic motivators, let's use that phrase, those drivers that are coming from inside them, whether it's their head or their heart or their gut, whatever's making them come back. If I keep stamping on that curiosity, what am I doing to them? Well, I'm trying to shove them into a box or into a place where I think they should be. And that's not what I think a teacher should be doing, or a coach or a guide or a mentor, whatever word you want to use. We are here to support, we are here to guide, we are here to answer questions, we are here to facilitate that exploration and that curiosity, that expression and that creativity. That is super important to me. Now, I'm not saying, let's bring it back to the practice routine thing. I've gone into like lesson, sort of like talking about what's happening in the lessons, whereas we can relate that to the practice routine because, again, if that curiosity is nurtured and fed and grown, they will want to be around their drums at home more too. It's just that simple. It really is, especially with a young student. It has to be fun. It has to be engaging. It has to be more than just play that because I said so and you'll get good if you practice X amount of time for X amount of years, whatever it is. I just don't think it's that straightforward. Call me out on that if you want, but that's what I believe, and that's what I've seen in my experience, and what I've seen in my students, and what I've seen in myself as well, and many of my peers. So bringing that back to the practice routine, yeah, let that curiosity just seep out when they go home as well. It's really important for me here at Alex Drum School that the learning doesn't just stop when they leave this room. They only come. Lots of these students come for 30 minutes a week. Majority of our students, and it's really important that they take that like inspiration and that want for more away from the studio, because they're not going to be back for another 7 days. Like, it's a long time, and if there's nothing happening at home in those 7 days, again, several things. The rate of learning is going to be super slow. The drive to want to do it's probably going to start waning, dropping off, and they're not going to want to come back and be around the drums. And that's that, it's a bit of a cliche again, but it's that thing of like, how many people do we know as adults that say, oh, I wish I'd put the time in, or, I started learning but then sort of lost my motivation. And I find that, like, without being too dramatic, like, I find that quite sad sometimes, because I see it in these people that they wish they had, and there's maybe a slight air of regret around that for them. Now, I'm not saying everyone needs to be career musicians, taking it to the nth degree, pursuing and driving hard and doing all that stuff. You can just play for fun because you love it. You don't need to be pursuing top 40 stardom, all this stuff. It doesn't need to be that. Because as someone who has touched a little bit of that, I didn't have like massive success, but I did have a little bit, and I experienced some cool things. I always brought it back to just playing. It was always about just playing. And yes, don't get me wrong, I don't want to sound too blasé. It's wicked playing arenas and going on tour buses and doing all that stuff. It's really, really cool. But the reason I was there was because I loved it. The reason I was there because I was curious. The reason I put in so many hours and so much time to get to that point was because I genuinely really wanted to know this stuff. And that I think came from being allowed by my teachers in the past to have space to do that. And it's super important. So bringing it back to the big question for this episode, which is, does a beginner need a practice routine? I think the answer is yes and no. I think it's both. What does that look like for someone at home who's listening to this and they're trying to figure it out? When you're building your practice routine, which I'll do another episode on so that there's more detail around that, try and understand that some days you're going to need to have that discipline, sort of rigidity, where you just work, not just where you're working through things like rudiments, things like technique, things like improving speed or control, whatever it is you're working on. But also allow intentional time to do the complete opposite, to whether that's put a song on and play along to it, or take the skins off your drums, figure out how that works, undo your bass pedal, like figure out different spring tensions, change your stool height. Like I'm trying to look over at a drum kit here in our studio to get ideas. There's countless ideas. Allow yourself time and space for that creativity and for that exploration, because it will pay off massively with your drive to want to be sat behind your drums. It just will. I promise you. If I'm wrong, I'm not gonna hold myself to anything, actually. Just trust me, okay? As someone who's spent a lot of time sat behind a drum kit. I hope this episode was useful for you. It's been a real pleasure spending this short amount of time. Hopefully it will answer some questions for you or your little one if you're listening, for your student, for your kid, your child who's learning. And feel free to hit me up on Instagram at Al's Drum School. You can DM me if you have any questions. Facebook, same thing, Al's Drum School, or head to alsdrumschool.co.uk. Come and have a chat, book a lesson with me, book a free taster. Come and hang out. It'd be great to meet you and great to see you. I hope you all have a lovely day, week, or month, whatever you're doing, and I will see you in the next episode. Peace.